The Tweed is absolutely blessed with climate that can grow pasture feed pretty much all year round, but the base of most pastures here is subtropical grass that's warm season active and will grow probably only about a tonne of feed in the winter, and that really restricts carrying capacity on the farm. So what we're interested in doing was trying to see whether we could put a multi-species mix into the farm to improve winter and spring, because spring is probably even more critical because it starts to get warm and can get dry. So we wanted to look at, could we put something in that would grow through winter and spring, but also have the potential for some of those species, those high quality species, to carry into summer to improve the quality of the subtropical grass dominant pastures. You know, the sward here has very little legume content, and the weight gain potential on those pastures in summer is not as high as it could be if we could get some more legumes or herbs or other species into the summer. So the aim here was to use a planting implement called the Soilkee, which is a pasture renovator. So the Soilkee puts seed into the soil, but also it basically has a rotary hoe blade that cuts about 4 inches roughly every half metre. So it doesn't disturb all the soil, but it creates a mini seed bed within the pasture sward. So you've got seed that can come up on about 15% of the area. So ideally leaving the rest of the pasture intact. The winter active species, the ryegrass, the oats, the brassicas have done really well winter, early spring, and then from mid-spring on we've seen chicory, white and red clover start to take over and then grow through the summer. Most of these trials we're producing feed somewhere in the order of $100 to $150 a tonne, which compared to trying to buy in supplementary feed or grain or pellets when you could be paying $200, $400, $600 a tonne depending on the quality. That's the first point. The feed we're growing here is of a significantly higher quality. Cattle grazing these pastures can put on around 1 kilo a day, as opposed to only putting on about 300 grams per head per day on the tropical pastures. We focused firstly on the mix and then on the seeding machinery. We've really only touched the surface on nutrition in terms of what we're feeding it. So we've had a little bit of a look at some synthetic fertiliser, and we've had a little bit of a look at poultry manure pellets. But you know, there's a range of other options that we probably need to explore, like you know, some of the composted manures that could add significantly, and then we need to sort of again have a look and see how they stack up economically. The synthetic fertilisers are getting more and more expensive, and they really only just deliver the nutrient. They don't deliver a lot of the other things like organic matter to the soil, and maybe doing damage to the biological activity in the soil.
You are better off pumping the water up to a header tank and gravity feeding back to the livestock. And in that system you can just run that one pipe situation where you can pump into that pipe anywhere along that pipeline, and you can come off that pipe anywhere along that pipeline to run your troughs. I'd really look for a permanent water source, either a dam, a creek or a spring. If you have got a water source that's higher than the point of where you require the water, you can make a gravity feed system where you come up over either the dam wall or out of the spring. If it's set up properly, they're very reliable. Personally, I'd always get the water tested and checked before you put it into any situation. If it was just for irrigation, I wouldn't so much worry, but when you're feeding cattle and animals, you want that water to be pretty good quality. Sizing a pipe depends on the length of your systems. If it's not very far away from an item, you can use a smaller pipe. If it is a long way, yeah, definitely try and get volume through that pipe, especially if you've got to pump water up to a higher head or something. You've got to go definitely big because you get friction loss through your poly pipe. Where there isn't any power or people don't want to spend money on fuel, you can put solar in. A solar pump is all automatic. You don't have to go back there and test it. It just runs, fills the tank, and then gravity feeds out through your system. It is good to keep your troughs and everything checked, Always make sure all your pipe work in your trough is covered up from cattle, because they do try and nudge everything, not just cattle, most animals. They like to check things out, especially horses. With installing the systems, if you're in like good country where there's not much rock and gravel and everything, you can use a lower class poly pipe, the cheaper poly pipe, like they call it rural pipe. Personally, I'd rather use the blue line, the heavier walled stuff, because once you put it in the ground, you can get holes in the pipe where the ground moves underneath the pipe, and you can get rocks that put holes literally in the pipe over a period of time. It won't be for the first few years, but after that, it's very hard to find leaks in systems if the pipe's buried any lower than about 200 to 300. It is better if you use a higher quality pipe in the first place. It saves you a lot of time later on.
People might ask you, well, what is the importance of dung beetles in relation to drought? And if we look at a dung beetle is taking the resource on top of the ground, which is, let's face it, recycled grass, and they're taking that material and putting it underneath the soil, sometimes, depending on the species, up to a metre of depth. Now that doesn't necessarily change things too much. It takes nutrients down, so we've got a nutrient cycling process going on immediately. Those nutrients allow microbial activity, which then gets in a process to feed microbes and fungi under the soil, and those are the critters that increase our soil health and maintain our humus levels. Humus is one of the really great storage vessels for water and nutrients in the soil. And there's an often quoted figure that a 1% increase in soil humus levels can lead to an increased storage of 144,000 litres of water per hectare. If they're a vector that's happy to bury all of that manure that would otherwise be sitting on soil surface and help us to increase those humus levels, it increases our capacity to store water, which means the longer game there is that more water stored, longer dry periods that we can sustain, and the more water that soil can absorb and hold for later use when it doesn't rain. In the Murwillumbah area, the species that exist here, there's 5 main species that have been detected. Those species are all late spring or spring to late autumn active. The one gap that sticks out though is that there's an absence of beetles that are active during the winter months. What that means is that there's no nutrient cycling. You have a lot of cows and a lot of manure produced across those 4 to 5 to 6 months that's not being buried in the soil. We have fouling on soil surface. We have, a potential for internal parasite cycles to start. So there is a potential to introduce a couple of species that are known to be winter active, one of those being Onitis caffa. The unknown is whether it will tolerate or will establish in the moisture environment that exists in this region. So that said, if we can keep them away from inundated areas up on the hills where it drains and things like that, it's worth a try.
We'd like to thank everyone who's been involved in this project. Tweed Landcare, North Coast Local Land Services, Water New South Wales, all the industry and technical experts, and most importantly the local farmers